Well, hello and welcome to The Zone. I'm your host, Big Wave Dave.
Ladies and gentlemen, will you please put your hands together for Wavy Davy?
Wavy Davy!
Today we're going to kick off our three-part series on refuting evolution.
Oh, wait, you serious? Let me laugh even harder.
Today's episode, Understanding the Basics.
You don't have any idea what you're talking about.
When someone asks you, do you believe in evolution? Please don't say no.
Are you saying I'm stupid?
Instead, you should ask them
whether they believe in the theory of gravity, or the cell theory of biology, or the germ theory of disease. Should we refer to atomic theory and then ask whether they believe that atoms are real or just a theory? To show how absurd it is to even ask whether we believe in science the same way you can only make believe in religion. So Wavy Davy thinks he can refute evolution. If he could, he would win a Nobel Prize, as well as the Templeton Prize, because evolution is one of the best supported theories in all of science, better supported than even the theory of gravity. However, evolution is also the most scrutinized and critically examined and rigorously tested of all scientific theories, only because it challenges a literal interpretation of a favorite fairy tale and not for any other reason. Yet, despite this, it has never failed any test. All new evidence and experiments in any relevant field always only ever add further support. It was already well researched upon publication and has only gotten more robust over time. The general theory consistently demonstrates profound predictive and explanative power and has never been contradicted by any fact or study ever, always passing critical analysis by some of the best minds in modern history, though it is never the best minds who question or try to challenge it. According to the National Academy of Science, evolution has become the foundation of modern biology, because even Christian biologists admit that nothing in biology makes sense, except in light of evolution. But now we are told that we are about to see this most robust of all scientific theories finally refuted, not by a scientist, nor by a scholar or expert in anything, but by a mere layman, a Sunday school teacher from the electric company who has already demonstrated that he can't refute evolution because he doesn't even know what it is.
What do you mean by that? Are we talking about adaptation or genetic variation, or maybe natural selection or Darwinian evolution? You see, the word evolution has a lot of different meanings.
No, it doesn't. There's only two. The colloquial usage refers to any change over time, but unless otherwise specified, when scientists speak of evolution, they're referring to the one and only theory of biodiversity, summarily defined as descent with inherent genetic modification. Paraphrased for clarity, it is the process of varying allele frequencies among reproductive populations, leading to usually subtle changes in the morphological or physiological composition of descendant subsets. A single individual bearing novel characteristics is not evolution yet, not until that trait is inherited by its descendants and then spread through the wider group via population mechanics. Then it becomes the sort of change over time that we regard as within the theory of evolution. Successive generations can expand biodiversity when continuing variation between genetically isolated groups eventually lead to one or more descendant branches increasingly distinct from their ancestors or cousins. So whether we're talking about adaptation or the emergence of new breeds through artificial selection or new species or higher taxa via natural selection or genetic drift, whenever one population becomes two or more morphologically and genetically distinct ones, even by selectively breeding a new line of dogs or deriving new cultivars in agriculture, all of that is evolution. But Darwinian evolution is not life arising from non-living chemicals. Abiogenesis is not any form of evolution at all. Instead, the origin of life is a series of overlapping chemical processes, none of them being the evolutionary processes. Evolution is how life diversifies, primarily via genetics, which means that you have to have genetic life before evolution can begin. And the reason we ever refer to Darwinian evolution at all, rather than just evolution by itself, is because Darwin's theory was not the first attempted explanation of biodiversity. Back in the 19th century and even in the 18th century, people already knew that life could evolve, but they didn't know how. In 1802, pioneer biologist Jean-Baptiste Pierre-Antoine de Monet Chevalier de Lamarck proposed an evolutionary chain wherein species could change through acquired characteristics, assuming, for example, that if you took up bodybuilding, then your children would somehow be born stronger. Apart from one aspect of epigenetics, both of Lamarck's postulations proved to be wrong. But Lamarckism was still more popular than Darwinism, especially with ambitious leaders well into the 20th century. And during that time, if you spoke of biodiversity at all, you had to specify whether you're talking about Lamarckian or Darwinian evolution. And Darwinian evolution refers primarily to two mechanisms that Darwin himself proposed, being natural selection and then also sexual selection. And these mechanisms were to explain how species adapt to dynamic environmental conditions. So looking at Bisbee's list here, adaptation and natural selection are both aspects of Darwinian evolution. And that leaves genetics, which Darwin didn't know anything about. He knew that sexually reproductive animals were inheriting some as yet undetermined units of information from both of their parents, but he couldn't figure out how that worked. And soon after, Gregor Mendel, an Augustinian monk in what is now the Czech Republic, solved Darwin's dilemma with his discovery of genes. The integration of genetics with natural selection became the modern synthesis of Mendelo-Darwinian evolution, or neo-Darwinism, and it included a new mechanism, genetic drift. But that was a long time ago. And now there are even more mechanisms, such that what was once called Darwinism in the 19th century and then neo-Darwinism in the 20th century is now the extended evolutionary synthesis, not Darwinism in any form at all anymore. Because no one need distinguish the modern concept of evolution from Lamarckism anymore, because even epigenetics is part of the general theory of evolution now.
Now let's start by taking a closer look at these two. Now, most scientists agree that all the different breeds of dogs came from wolf-like ancestors.
Now, they weren't just wolf-like, they were wolves, Asiatic wolves. And it's not just that all of the scientists agree, not just some of them, but all of them. They all do agree, but only because morphology, archaeology, and genetics all point that way strongly, with apparently no other possible alternative.
But how did we get so many breeds? I mean, there are hundreds of them. Well, the answer is adaptation and genetic variation.
Yes, but that's not a complete answer. It would be more accurate to say that artificial selection works a whole lot faster than natural selection can, especially since breeders select for all manner of arbitrary criteria designed to suit the interest of the breeder, whereas natural selection is a blind, incidental, unguided, and thus slower process that only benefits the organism itself, and not the people who want to manipulate it for their own purposes instead.
Now, in the first 9 chapters of Genesis, God commanded his creatures 5 times to be fruitful and multiply.
Objection! Hearsay! You're using it to prove the truth of the matter asserted.
The Bible is just a storybook with no demonstrable basis in actual fact and thus no relevance to science. Everything the Bible says about science is laughably stupid, and that includes everything it says about biology. Don't forget that the Bible says that if cattle mate while looking at striped sticks, they will bear striped calves. But the Bible is wrong because that doesn't work at all, ever. So there was never any reason to believe that, and whoever wrote that obviously didn't know anything about genetics.
And to help them do that, God gave living creatures the ability to adapt.
Objection assumes a fact not in evidence.
You don't get to say things are true just because you want them to be. It is dishonest to assert baseless speculation as if it was a matter of fact. If you claim something to be true when you cannot even know whether it is, that's called lying. You can't make a statement of fact unless you can show the truth of it. And positive claims require positive evidence, and what is asserted without evidence may be dismissed without evidence. So if you say that your God gave his creatures this ability, but you can't show the facts to support that assertion, then I am justified in saying no, he didn't. I don't have to prove that he didn't, because your assertion of impossible absurdity is unsupported and thus effectively false, and does not warrant any further discussion or consideration.
Here's how it works. Living creatures have the ability to detect certain changes in the environment, and then they switch on and off programmed responses. The important thing is to remember is this: the mechanisms for implementing these changes are already within the creature.
Not necessarily.
For example, in the winter, the coat of the Arctic fox turns white, and in the summer, it turns gray. Now this helps him hunt and stay safe from predators. Now depending on where these dogs live, certain features get turned on and off, and then over time, when they reproduce, you end up with a wide variety of different types of dogs. Now, is this the result of random mutations?
Yes, it is.
Actually, it's not. Yes, it is. What we're looking at here is the result of programmed responses to environmental changes and genetic variations. No, it isn't.
They're not programmed. Dogs are not computerized machines. There is genetic variation, but where does that variation come from? College textbooks on genetics, like this one, explain that there are two processes responsible for genetic variation: recombination and mutation. So it is not true that all the ancestors of dogs have always had hormonal responses to seasonal changes, which can evolve via natural selection, though Bisbee misrepresents that as pre-programmed responses in an attempt to plead for intelligent design. That's also why he is simply wrong when he says that variation doesn't come from mutations. He has to deny their randomness in defense of the fantasy that everything happens for an intended purpose according to some mystical design.
Well, here's the thing. When I said that, I was lying.
Dogs are a little different. We got to take into account something called selective breeding. Now here's the way it works. Sometimes people want a dog that looks a certain way, like this adorable little schnauzer puppy. So if you want a puppy that looks like that, well, what do? Well, you find parents that look like that, and then they have puppies. Lots and lots of puppies. Now this is what people call a purebred. Now sometimes people want to combine breeds and make some new varieties. Let's play a game. The dogs along the top are the parents. These cute little guys are the puppies. Let's see if you can guess who the parents are. Let's start with this first one. Okay, who do you think the parents are? Make your guess. That is a golden doodle. And what about this cute little guy? That's a labradoodle. Okay, what about this adorable little girl? What do you think? That is a cockapoo. The result of all this, we now have hundreds and hundreds of different breeds of dogs. We have tall dogs, skinny dogs, fat dogs, hot dogs, all kinds of dogs.
Except that doesn't work to generate these breeds in the first place. Creationists like to turn evolution upside down, trying to imagine that you mix two different breeds or species to get a third, because they can't admit that variation comes from mutations. Thus, one variety becomes two, and then 4 and 8, and so on. And there is no other explanation when we already know that the hundreds of dog breeds we have today came from just one ancestral species, Asiatic wolves. You can't derive hundreds of new breeds from that unless variation comes from mutation. The wolves are highly refined super predators, and it would be hard to make them any better at wolfing. But one thing that people want are dogs that are not quite so likely to kill and eat their owners. So we took their evolution in a different direction. A long-running experiment in Russia selectively bred many generations of foxes, which, if Bisbee would write, would only produce the same type of foxes forever. Instead, they identified and isolated mutations, and they found a correlation that the friendly, easily domesticated foxes also had floppy ears and curly tails, looking an awful lot like dogs. And other associated mutations produced different color patterns as well as variable shapes and sizes, just like when people selected mutations to produce new breeds of dogs that were loyal and loving, becoming man's best friend. A great example of this is the story of a Chinese empress who saw a dog that she thought looked like a lion. And not like an actual African lion, but like the stylized lions that were popular in traditional Chinese art. And that dog was a mutant, and she bred it with other vaguely similar dogs until that same mutation appeared again. And then she kept doing it to favor that mutation until they had established a stable breed from the city of Peking, known as the Pekingese. This can only happen as a result of mutation, not crossbreeding already diversified groups the way Bisbee describes.
But here's what you need to remember. They are all still just dogs. They're not evolving or turning into some other type of creature. They're still dogs.
Another strawman misrepresentation that creationists always use and refuse to correct is the mistaken idea that evolution means one kind of thing changing into another fundamentally different kind of thing, as if descendants are not even related to their parents, like a pine tree giving birth to an elephant, or a cornstalk growing hamsters, that sort of distorted nonsense. And they do that so that whenever a new species of fruit fly or finch evolves, the wanna pretenders can deny that it doesn't really count because it's still a fly or it's still a finch, which of course it would be. Diversifying into new varieties is how evolution works, but believers can't admit that. They got to deny that, saying that it didn't turn into something else. And creationists use this deliberate distortion to keep themselves confused, to try and deny the fact that Going from one species of Asiatic wolves to hundreds of breeds of domestic dogs qualifies as evolution, which of course it does. Yes, those dogs are evolving, but remember that evolution is descent with inherent modification, meaning that every new genus or species that ever evolved was just a modified version of whatever its ancestors were. That's how you get one species to branch out into hundreds of uniquely distinct subsets. But in this case, we're not just talking about one species, but a number of different ones that can no longer interbreed to bring forth after their kind, and therefore should be called different kinds, even though we can prove that they are still closely related. Thus refuting the whole notion of kinds being special creations, magical conjurations unrelated to anything else. We know better than that in this case. So we should abandon the word kind, especially since the term has no scientific application, and use species in its stead, since the only definition given in the Bible implies that both words mean essentially the same thing.
We're going to talk more about that during the session too.
Good, because there's a lot wrong with this illustration. I corrected some of the problems with it in my last video and still more in this video, but there are a few big issues with it left that I have yet to address, so I can't wait to cover this stupid thing again.
Let's talk about natural selection. These two dogs are madly in love, so they decide to get married and have puppies. Now, I want you to notice something. These dogs both have medium hair. They have the genetic information for short hair or long hair, which means when they have puppies, there are three possible outcomes. They can have puppies with short hair, with medium hair, or with long hair. Now let's say, okay, these puppies grow up and they decide to move. Let's say they go to the desert. What's going to happen? Well, dog number one, he's going to be just fine because he has short hair. Now the second one, he's going to struggle because it's hot and his hair is kind of long. But he's got some options because of his genetic makeup. He can either leave, quickly adapt, and if he can't do those, then he's going to perish. Now the third dog, he's in a lot of trouble because he can't adapt. So he has two options. He can either leave or perish. Now animals that can adapt or relocate, this is the outcome. Aww. So what we see quite often is animals that are well suited for the environment tend to dominate that area. In this case, dogs with short hair would be the ones that lived in deserts. And just the opposite would be true in cold climates.
The problem with this, besides the oversimplification and generalization, is the assumption that mutations are never involved, or that the potential for any possible variety is always already encoded into the genome. Not the case. And not all mutations are novel. Some may be retained even if they're not expressed until after skipping a few generations, or when both father and mother have a compatible set of a particular gene. But the longer that gene is not expressed, the more likely it will eventually be disabled altogether, never to be expressed again, although atavisms can occur, albeit rarely. And there is always a growing possibility that a mutation could produce a whole new variant that wasn't already in the genome of either parent.
So there's some important things that we need to know about natural selection. First, nature doesn't have a brain. It's not a person, so it's not capable of selecting anything.
Except that, as Bisbee just explained himself, those organisms that can adapt and do survive, and those that don't. And we say that the survivors were selected in that way. We understand that we're only talking about an unconscious process with an emergent result. We're not trying to anthropomorphize that to imagine some godlike Mother Nature character deciding that she doesn't like these ones or she prefers those others.
The second thing is natural selection doesn't actually create or form new creatures.
Correct. Natural selection only selects new genetic variants that comes from mutations, and mutations are what create the new forms.
And finally, it is the ability or inability of a creature to adapt or relocate that often determines whether or not it lives. You see, natural selection is actually a process. It is the extinction of creatures that are unable to adapt or relocate. You get it?
Sure I do. You're the one who doesn't get it.
This is too simplistic and too limited. Mutations can also produce a significant advantage such that an organism doesn't just barely survive in a given environment, but thrives in it. In such instances, that mutation can spread throughout the community through population genetics via interbreeding subsequent generations. And just for one of many examples, Tibetans have a mutation of 2 genes that enable them to better endure prolonged periods at high altitudes without succumbing to apoplexia, also known as altitude sickness. An entirely different mutation with similar effects provides the same benefit for high-altitude natives in the Andes. In either case, those people adapted, not because whatever genes were already in their genome, either dominant or recessive, but because of novel genes brought about by mutation. And those same mutations might occur in sea-level communities where they wouldn't confer a preferential advantage, but then they wouldn't be selected, meaning that they wouldn't spread throughout the community generations later.
Great. Let's review. Adaptation are programmed responses to changes in the environment.
No, they're not. They're not programs. They're not programmed. There's no programmer, no intelligent designer, and there still wouldn't be even if there was a God. If you want to teach the basics, you should learn the basics first. I recommend Berkeley University's Evolution 101. On this page, it explains that adaptations are features that arose through mutation and were favored by natural selection by helping organisms survive and/or reproduce in the current environment. Adaptations can include behaviors, which we know are also chemical, that allow better evasion of predators, more successful mating, building better nests, improved social skills, or what have you.
Genetic variation is recombination of existing genetic information.
No, it isn't. Recombination is only secondary to mutations, which produce new genetic information.
And natural selection is a process. It is the extinction of living things that cannot relocate or adapt.
That's just one aspect of natural selection. Remember that evolution is about biodiversity, one species becoming 2, then 4, 8, 16, and so on, excepting for those that go extinct. They don't all have to die out for one thing to survive. Natural selection is also tied to adaptation, selecting mutations that allow for one original species to branch out and adapt to a number of different strategies for the same environment.
What's really important to understand is these processes have all been confirmed by observable science.
It's really important to understand that observable science has also confirmed beneficial mutations, adding new genetic information, being naturally selected for adaptation. If you're going to teach the basics of evolution, then you can't ignore any of this, because this is as basic as it gets. This is Microevolution 101.
Okay, you ready for the last one? Darwinian evolution. So let's start with the definition. What is it? Well, here's the definition from the Biology Teachers Association. The diversity of life on Earth is the outcome of evolution, an unsupervised, impersonal, unpredictable, natural... Oh, wow! Okay, let's make this a lot simpler, shall we? This is really what they're saying. That time plus chance equals life.
That's not true, and you know it.
But shame done. That's not what they really said.
No, that is not remotely like what it said or in any way implied. The definition given does not even hint at the origin of life, but religious apologists are allergic to the truth and have to distort everything into unintelligible gibberish to match their belief systems. They can't risk understanding the science because then they'd risk accepting forbidden knowledge. The slide Bisbee showed even gives the definition: descent with genetic modification affected by natural selection. That means that you have to have a genetic ancestry of organisms already alive to descend from. Bisbee read it out loud right up to that point and abruptly stopped there. So he's apparently seen the rest and knows what it really said. Yet he tells us that it says this instead?
You lied to me!
You see, evolutionists believe that millions and millions of years ago that somehow non-living chemicals suddenly became alive, like this, it's alive!
Nobody believes that. Well, creationists believe that. Y'all actually believe that dirt came to life, literally by magic, specifically by a golem spell. But we don't believe anything like that. Instead, we understand that the origin of life was a multi-stage sequence of unrelated processes in different chemical environments, building incrementally. I've seen dozens of peer-reviewed studies of some of the different stages therein, but none of that has anything whatsoever to do with Darwinian evolution. Neither of Darwin's mechanisms apply here, and there is no confusing this with Lamarckism either. Abiogenesis is not Darwinian evolution. It's not evolution at all.
Okay, time out. Reality check. When you look at living creatures and you look at things like human cells, you discover they are really complicated.
That's right. Life is complex. That's why the explanation for it is so complex. It requires interactive lessons and prerequisite courses just to understand the basics. The emergence of life cannot be explained by God magic, the simplest and most infantile excuse men ever made up to explain anything, and which doesn't explain anything. But as I said, evolution is not about the origin of life. It's how life diversifies.
Now Darwin, when he was around, when he looked into a microscope, all he could see was just like a little blob. Today we know that inside these cells are little factories and transportation systems, all kinds of different things going on in there.
One little tiny universe.
Which the apologists will only describe in terms that make everything sound as though it is artificially manufactured rather than biologically developed, because they want it to sound intelligently designed. Simple minds, easily confused, imagine that complexity implies design. Biochemistry is absurdly complex, unnecessarily complicated, especially considering how poorly some systems work. Such excessive complexity implies a haphazard, accidental assembly, because no inventor would design things in such a convoluted way, whereas a hallmark of intelligent design would be an efficient simplicity instead, such as we do not see anywhere in biochemistry.
There is no way that this could have created itself.
There are chemical pathways wherein these things really can develop naturally. What can't happen, what's not remotely possible at all, is the idea that all of this was conjured out of nothing, fully developed by a magic invisible deity whose wishes become real.
And yet evolutionists insist that, oh no, if we have billions of years, it can happen through mutations.
No. No, man.
Mutations have little or nothing to do with the origin of life, and it didn't take billions of years for life to begin either. What took billions of years was the subsequent evolution of life.
So what is a mutation? Mutation is when an animal or living creature reproduces, sometimes there are mistakes in the genetic information that is passed on to the offspring.
That's a fair explanation for the target audience of 6th graders, but the word mistake implies intent. A mutation is more like an occasional chemical glitch.
So theoretically, there are 3 different types of mutations. The first one is detrimental. Now what does that mean? It means bad things. We know of thousands of mutations that cause disease or death. Well, that's not going to help Darwinian evolution.
Darwin didn't understand genetics or mutations. Those were later discoveries in evolutionary biology that he never knew about. So if we're not talking about Darwinian mechanisms contrasted with Lamarckism, then it's not Darwinian evolution, it's just evolution.
What about the next one? Neutral. Now these are just like the name sounds. They don't really do much. Some examples might be an unusual eye color or hair color, or things like that.
Things that increase biodiversity using a non-selective mechanism like genetic drift. Evolution usually amounts to no more than subtle changes in physical or chemical proportions, and these can produce much more than just different colors. It can produce new range of shapes, of affectations and behaviors as well. And these are not selected for or against until or unless they impact or enhance the organism's ability to survive and reproduce.
Again, that's not going to help promote Darwinian evolution.
Again, genetic drift is not a Darwinian mechanism, so it is not specifically Darwinian evolution, it's evolutionary theory as a whole. It stopped being Darwin's theory soon after Darwin stopped being Darwin. Many other biologists have taken over in the century and a half since then.
What Darwinian evolution needs are mutations that can add tons and tons of complex information and then pass that on to offspring.
Wrong again, as always. People have, on average, 128 mutations per zygote just to start with, and we accrue more, and some of those may be passed on to our offspring. But evolution at every level is a matter of incremental, usually superficial changes being slowly compiled atop successive tiers of fundamental similarity. Every stage of it appears trivial and gradual viewed on its own, even if we're looking at punctuated equilibrium. If you accept, as Bisbee does, that panthers and felines and scimitar cats could all come from one original cat, then you could go back through the entirety of our evolutionary history in detail, and at any point where you would compare the prior step to the subsequent step, you would accept every one of those steps, no problem, one at a time. But Bisbee doesn't know about all those myriad incremental intermediate steps. At most, all he knows is bacteria to fish to amphibian to lizard to monkey to man. And that's almost entirely wrong too, because Bisbee doesn't know any better. That's why he should learn the basics before he tries to teach them.
So can random mutations do that? Can they provide this type of complex information?
Oh my God, yes.
This is what Lee Spetner, PhD of physics, said. He says he's never been able to find that kind of mutation.
Word of advice? It's not a good idea to ask a physicist to do their own research in biology via Google, especially when that physicist is not only working outside of their area of knowledge, but is also a known creationist, and thus refuses to acknowledge any evidence of evolution, which these science denialists habitually do.
Here's another one. Royal Truman, PhD in chemistry. He can't find even one example of this happening.
Again, he's a chemist, not a biologist, and he's a creationist, which means he will never admit to any of the foundational falsehoods of creationism. I, however, have conferred with a number of PhD professors of biology, developmental biologists, and even Christian biologists who have found several examples of that type of mutation, and I've independently found and read many peer-reviewed studies of such mutations myself. So I can prove that they exist, even if Professor Head in the Sand wants to pretend that they don't.
You see, what Darwinian evolution needs is a mechanism to add all kinds of complex, complicated information. If you want to go from goo to zoo to you, well, we need information on how to make arms and legs and nose and eyes and tongues and all kinds of things, right?
Done. We got this. Not just with Hox genes, but in some cases biologists, not physicists or chemists, but geneticists, have identified precisely which mutations where produce what effects. And paleontologists can correlate these incremental changes with myriad stages of evolutionary development indicated in the fossil record. We know a lot more than you don't. We know more than you wish we didn't.
Here's the problem. There is no mechanism, no known process in nature that can do that.
You're quoting from another creationist. In this case, an engineer, still not a biologist or a scientist at all, but a layman with no reliable understanding of the subject. That would be like having a willfully ignorant electrician teach evolution in Sunday school. But if you take a college course in genetics, the experts in that field will tell you that there definitely is a process by which to produce new genetic information.
This type of information always comes from an intelligent source.
No, it doesn't, and no, it can't. In Chapter 8 of my book on the foundational falsehoods of creationism, I've listed several beneficial mutations that were positively identified, what type of mutation it was, where it occurred, and what the effects are, and none of these can be attributed to any intelligence.
And yet, sadly, in a lot of the textbooks, we'll see that evolutionists confidently insist that it happened.
And we can prove that with documented experiments and observation that it is still happening and has been happening to our benefit throughout the entire history of agriculture.
You know, they use words like appeared, emerged, arose, words like that. We call them magic words.
You call those magic words. You, who believe in the supernatural, which is what magic is. You believe in miracles. That's magic by definition. You believe in magical enchantments like blessings and curses, potions, necromancy, incantations, transformations, the golem spell, and elemental spells involving wands. You, whose entire worldview depends on belief in magic. You think that if a mutation occurred or arose in an individual and is subsequently inherited by a wide percentage of descendants generations later, you think that's magic, and not all the sticks turning into snakes and faith healing, forecasting, water bending, witches, wizards, ghosts, demons, and exorcists you believe in? Right. This level of projection is what I refer to as the pot calling the silverware black. It's a form of the tu quo qui fallacy, where you try to project all your own faults onto others who will not share them, while you pretend as if those were not all your own faults to begin with.
Here's a couple of my favorites. Became a miracle of evolution and was lucky.
Of course, you say this without any citation, because each of the sources you did cite actually counted against you.
Now, these would almost be funny except for this. These are used in textbooks that are trying to convince people that we evolved from slime.
And we can effectively prove that, too, without any need of miracles or faith, and despite your faith to the contrary. Yet here is Wavy Davy Bisbee, a willfully ignorant Sunday school teacher and Dunning-Kruger spokesmodel, deliberately misleading children with utter incompetence but malice aforethought, misrepresenting everything he refuses to understand in order to mislead and deceive other people's children into believing that they came from a magically animated mud golem.
By the way, there was an evolutionist named Sir Fred Hoyle.
No, there wasn't. Fred Hoyle was an astronomer, not a biologist or paleontologist. He had absolutely no understanding of evolution nor tolerance for it, and he demonstrated that ignorance repeatedly. He hated evolution and instead believed in and advocated for his own strange brands of intelligent design and a different type of creationism too, trying to argue how the universe could remain in a steady state if only there were millions of creation events going on all the time.
And he was also a mathematician, and he sat down one day and decided to calculate the odds of going from goo to zoo to you.
And he did that without having any concept of what he was talking about. So he had no legitimate way to arrive at the base numbers, so he couldn't properly ascertain the probability. Instead, all he did was fabricate and exaggerate, like all creationists do.
All right? And here's what they are. They're the same odds as rolling a 6 on a dice 5 million times in a row. Wow! That would be pretty lucky, right? It's the same odds as a tornado ripping through a junkyard and making an airplane. Sounds impossible? That's because it is.
This coming from the guy who believes that a snake can talk, that a man can live 3 days inside a fish or walk on top of water, and that the sun can be stopped in the sky. This from a man who denies all reality in order to make believe that every living thing was poofed out of nothing by an incantation. Someone so credulous as to believe that a book of lies is the only truth in our world, as if everything and everyone else is a lie. Hoyle's argument showed that he had not even the slightest clue what evolution is or how it works, but his hatred of evolution was such that he invented several ridiculous parodies of it, including an argument from improbability fallacy, wherein, if you use arbitrary digits to factor in the improbability of everything you did or that happened to you yesterday, exactly when those things happened and in what order, if you figure in enough details, you can eventually make yesterday statistically impossible, even though you know it happened. Hoyle was no evolutionist. He was his own brand of creationist, trying to discredit what he refused to understand even a little bit, and in the process, he showed himself to be an utter incompetent, just like yourself, Mr. Bisbee. The one thing you've made clear in your lesson to understand the basics of evolution is you don't.